Hello and welcome to the first in my series of Spectrum Noir product reviews. This review centres around the Spectrum Noir alcohol markers, of which there are three main types: the original marker, the Illustrator and the graphic. And I'll just show you those in all their entirety here. So on the left we have the original markers, in the middle are the Illustrator and on the right are the graphic. Just make sure I'm lined up there. Okay, so each type of marker is double-sided and it comes in 216 colours. All three types share the same colour chart, although not all of the colours are comparable, but we'll come on to that a bit later. So firstly, I'll explain a little bit about what alcohol ink is and how it differs from water-based ink. Alcohol ink contains alcohol and dye, the dye for the colour and the alcohol as a solvent which enables the colours to merge and blend together. When the colouring dries, the alcohol evaporates, leaving only the dye behind. This is why it's really important to work quite fast with alcohol markers, as the best blends occur when the alcohol is still wet. You can layer and layer alcohol ink without pilling or ripping up the surface of the paper, which is what happens with water-based pens, because alcohol ink sits on top of the paper rather than soaking into the fibres and breaking them down. Alcohol ink can work on any type of paper, but it will almost always bleed through, so use in double-sided colouring books will ruin the design on the reverse side of that page. So now you've got the basics of alcohol ink, let's look at the pens themselves. So we have the original colouring system marker, we have the Illustrator marker, and we have the graphic marker. So, this here is the original colouring system marker. It's hexagonally shaped and it's black in colour with a soft rubbery gripping surface at either end. A grey band at one end indicates the bullet nib so that you can quickly identify which side is which at a glance. The other end is a flat, wide chisel nib for colouring block areas that don't require a detailed nib. This is what you might use to colour skies, for example, so that you can cover a larger area faster. For the most part though, colourists will favour this bullet nib. It provides a thick line whilst being tapered at the tip for getting into smaller spots. It all depends how much pressure you put on it. So some colourists were unhappy with how thick the bullet nib was and they didn't find the hard chisel nib useful. So Spectrum Noir created the Illustrator marker. It has a white body and coloured ends which list the colour name and number. So this pen features a very fine bullet at one end and a thick soft brush nib at the other. This is ideal for colourists because the brush allows you to create thick soft lines which aren't as harsh as the chisel and they can fill in areas quickly, whilst this bullet tackles any tricky spots on the same design. Graphic designers and artists generally prefer the chisel nib in their work, but they also need that finer line to work with the wide one as well. So Spectrum Noir took this on board and created the graphic marker. This bullet nib is more like a bullet brush. It has the shape of a bullet, but it feels quite soft on application. All three of the bullet nibs actually are quite soft and pliable rather than hard and rigid like pro markers, for instance. So all the pens have that play, which is useful for keeping your colouring streak free. Now we've seen each marker individually, let's talk about the Spectrum Noir colour system. Much like Copic pens, Spectrum Noir pens rely on a number and letter code which pertains to the colour and shade. For example, this pen is TN1 and the TN stands for tan, so we know it's in the tan family. The number 1 will always be the lightest value. So when we get to TN2, we know that we're still in the tan family, but it's going to be a slightly darker shade than before, and 3, 4, 5 and so on will be darker and darker. Colours in the same family will always blend well together, and the amount of seamlessness in that blend will depend on how many numbers you've used. So you're going to get a better graduation using TN2, 4 and 6 than you would just using TN2 and 6. Therefore, you know that if you stay within the same family when blending, you'll always get a good result. There are several different families across the whole 216 pen set. We have BT, which is blue turquoise, and TB, which is true blue. Here it is. There's also HB, which is hydrangea blue, and IB for ice blue. So there really is a plethora of different shades and midtones that you just wouldn't find in water-based pen sets. All the colours are really vibrant and super juicy, So you get a really bold and saturated look with alcohol markers that really makes your coloured pages pop. One thing that differs across the 3 pen types, as I mentioned earlier, is the colours themselves. So just because, for example, this Illustrator marker is CR2, it doesn't mean that the CR2 in the original Spectrum Noir is going to match the colour, and you can just see that here. When I pop these together, here's the Illustrator and here's the Spectrum Noir original marker. And another good example of this is the TNs. Where are we? TN. So if we look at TN 1 and 2 here, it's quite a light sort of light brown colour and a darker brown. Here we have a sort of light peach and a darker peach. So they're not the same across the different types of pens. They do still use the same colours, they've just moved them around for some reason. So a little bit confusing, but if you swatch all of your pens out, it's no problem at all. So let's have a look at some of my completed alcohol marker work before I show you the pens in action. This is Hannah Lynn's Lady Liberty illustration, which I coloured with Spectrum Noir. And as you can see, every part of her is beautifully seamless. This is another lady that I coloured from Meg Cowley's Fantasy Creatures, again using different shades, all within the same colour families to create a flawless transition. You don't always have to blend if you don't want to. I actually use block colouring on this Sweet Pea Swing illustration by Amelia Gregory, and the bold colours look fabulous in their own right. Here's my cover of Lost Ocean by Johanna Basford, coloured completely with Spectrum Noir markers. It really is eye-catching, and I love that the markers will work on smooth or glossy book covers, whereas pencils just wouldn't take to the surface. One more, here's another lady, but I do love colouring skin and hair with alcohol markers. This illustration is from Jasmine Beckett Griffith's colouring book and shows how much depth you can create with things like the sea when you have all these different tones to play with. Okay, so let's do some real-time colouring so you can see a few tips and techniques in action. I've stamped this image from one of Crafter's Companion series of stamps with some Memento ink, that's this stuff. And this is what you use with alcohol markers when stamping, because the lines will stay completely sharp and crisp and they won't be affected by the alcohol at all. So here are a few that I coloured earlier. As you can see, lots of different skin and hair tones. And I think we're going to go with the Flesh family for her skin, and we'll go with the golden browns for her hair. So before I get started, I just want to really quickly explain an important fact about using these pens that might go some way to explaining why certain people say that alcohol markers still streak when they colour. Remember earlier I mentioned that you can layer and layer the ink to make different tones and get it darker? Well, the actual colour of the ink is not what you see when you put down one layer. In order to get the full saturation of colour, you must lay down lots and lots of layers until it's completely soaked through the paper. Let me show you what I mean. So here I've got one layer of ink. In order to get the full saturation of colour, you have to lay down lots of layers, and you can barely see this one layer on the underside of the card, as you can see. I'm actually using 300 GSM marker card to make that's made to take this heavy ink, so it also depends on what paper you use and how many layers you'll need. So when I add another layer on top, you can see it looks darker and it's left a line. So you're thinking, how is everyone raving about these pens being seamless when they're clearly not at this point? So we turn the card over again, and you'll notice that the saturation is much darker than before, but it's still not fully bled through. With a few more layers, you'll notice that the reverse of the card will start to get properly saturated. So it's getting a little bit more. And once it's fully saturated, you will not get any lines at all, and this swatch will not get any darker. It just won't. There'll be nowhere else to go with it. It will be the absolute darkest it can get, and it will be the true shade of the pen, the true shade of EB3. So as you can probably see now, we're adding layers and it's not getting any darker at all. It's very, very seamless. And on the other side, it's completely saturated. Now, you should use paper underneath anything that you do with alcohol markers. I'm really naughty, I should have done that, but as you can see, it will bleed through onto the surface underneath. But that is how you build tones with an alcohol pen. So this is the initial colour that you would put down. As you can see, really light, but the actual true colour is when it's fully saturated on the page and you can't add any more colour to it, and there's absolutely no lines or seams whatsoever. So with all that in mind, let's start off with our little girl and go with our FS2. So as I mentioned, you can colour straight over the Memento ink because it's meant for alcohol markers and it won't bleed or anything. And this FS2 or Flesh 2 is just our light base layer on this little girl's face. As I mentioned, do keep it nice and wet because you will get lines if it's not properly saturated. So we've put lots and lots of ink down on there now, and we'll get our FS1 and go around the edges of her face to create a bit of shadow. And go underneath the hairline where you would have natural shadows from where her hair's falling on her face. Again, we'll make sure we've got a nice good layer of that on there. Now obviously we've got a line because we've not fully saturated the paper. So we're coming back in with our FS2, going over that edge and making it really nice and seamless. You can do this a couple of times if you still find you've got edges and lines. And if you wanted to make the contrast a little bit stronger, you just add in some more of the darker colour. And again, with the lightest, just buff over those edges. Until you're happy. We're going to grab the colours for the hair now, and I think we're going to go with GB 8, 9 and CT2. So we'll start off with the GB 8. And what we're going to do is use a flicking motion from the parting of the hair. I'm just going to turn this around because it's easier for me to actually flick away from myself so that we get a tapered point to the flicks rather than one thick line, making it look like hair strands. So then we'll go in with our GB9, which is a bit darker, and just go over the tips of the strands that we've already put down. Go darker into the centre parting because that's where it would naturally be darker, and that you would get the light bouncing off this curved edge of the hair. Go back in with our GB8 and just extend these lines a little bit. We do want a shine and a highlight, but we don't want it to be that big, so we'll just extend them out a little. And if you just wanted to make the ends darker, back in with your GB9 and just keep layering it until you're happy. So we're now going to grab our CT2, which is our lightest colour, and it will act as the highlight. Now this does look quite stark when you first look at it against the brown that we've put down, blondie brown, but it'll work. So we'll pop all that highlight in there, and then we'll come back in with our second lightest colour, our GB8, a middle colour, and just extend those strands even more, using the natural curve of the hair. Now you can block colour hair in a seamless way like I did for instance on the Lady Liberty, but I quite like this way of doing it because it just shows sort of the individual strands of hair, looks a little bit more realistic. So again, you can go back in with your darkest, your GB9 if you wanted to, and just keep playing with it until you're happy. Bring a few of those strands a little bit further up. And as I say, the CT2, which looked really bright and strange at first against the browns, is now acting as a beautiful blonde highlight. So that's a quick way of doing skin and hair. Now obviously I've done it on a small image, but you can apply this to larger illustrations as well. And as I learn how to colour more realistic skin, such as like defining the cheekbones and stuff, I'll be sure to upload a tutorial of that too. Now let's talk about price for a moment. Alcohol markers are notorious for being expensive. Just take Copics as an example. Their pens retail at £4 to £6 a pen, just crazy amount of money. And it's around $50 or £50 rather for a set of 12. And a larger set of 72 colours will set you back over £300. Spectra Noir markers have a comparable quality for a fraction of the price, making them affordable and attainable most importantly. So for a pack of 24 of these, you're looking at just over £23 on Amazon. That's under £1 a pen. You can buy them in sets of 6 and 24, and none of the packs have duplicate colours, so you can collect packs as you go, as you can afford them, to build up your collection. The Illustrator and the graphic markers are a little more expensive because they contain 25% more ink than the original marker, but they're not ridiculously expensive. So the 12 packs of Illustrator and graphic are between £17 and £25, and the 6 packs are between £11 and £13. The great thing about the Illustrator and the graphic is that you can also buy them open stock for just £2.50 a pen on Crafter's Companion. The markers are designed to be refillable, but the ink refills aren't yet readily available, so I'll keep an eye on that and let you know. You can also buy replacement nibs if you find that they've become worn with extended use. So let's try a few more blends so that you can see again how they work. We're going to use the brush nib of the Illustrator this time, and let's use the HB family. Where are we? HB. Here we go. So the HB are the Hydrangea Blues. And let's start off with a layer of the lightest one, HB1. Let's get a good amount of ink down on the page so that we can blend this together without having any lines. We're then going to go in with the next colour, which is HB2. And this is just off the cuff, so it's not going to be perfect. And where we can see that HB2 meets the HB1, we'll use our HB1 to just buff it out a little bit and get rid of any lines. Finally, we've got our HB3, our darkest colour. As you can see, this brush nib lays down so much juicy ink, it's an absolute joy to use. So we have HB2 just to buff away the line of the darkest colour. And the HB1 to go over it. So as you can see, an absolutely beautiful blend already. I think we've pretty much saturated the other side, so there's not too many more layers you can do on that, but as you can see, just a super quick, nice blend. And if you wanted to just perfect that even more, you just keep adding a little bit more ink until that entire area is saturated and it looks even more blended. So I hope this video has gone some way to helping you understand how alcohol markers work and how they can look absolutely amazing when used properly. It's been a bit of a bitty video here and there, but I've done my best to try and explain. If there's any questions you have about any of these markers, please leave them in the comments and I'll be sure to get back to you and answer those as best I can. Thank you so much for watching. Please do subscribe to my channel. I'll be doing a whole week this week of Spectrum Noir reviews, including all of their pencil line, the aqua markers, the sparkle pens, and all sorts of different papers and things like that. So please do subscribe and watch the channel this week. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon on Colour with Claire.